When you picture the Titanic, you probably think of the grand staircase, the elegant dining rooms, maybe even Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet on the bow of the ship. It's a story of luxury, glamour, and ultimately tragedy. But the real heart of the Titanic didn't beat in the ballroom. It beat deep in the ship's fiery belly, to a much more brutal rhythm, a relentless pace set by fire, steel, and sweat. This was the world of the forgotten army known as the Black Gang, the men who waged a constant war to power the world's most famous liner. They were the invisible engine of the floating palace, men whose faces were permanently etched with coal dust, and whose days were spent in a man-made hell. This isn't a story of champagne and string quartets. This is the story of what it was really like to be a coal worker on the Titanic. The name they were given, the Black Gang, was brutally literal. It came from the inescapable grime of their work, a constant coating of black coal dust that worked its way into every pore and under every nail. This group was the core of the ship's engineering department, and it had a clear hierarchy. The main roles were the firemen, the trimmers, and the greasers. The core of this group consisted of 163 firemen, 73 trimmers, and 13 leading firemen, who acted as supervisors. They were the powerhouse of the vessel, the human machinery that fed the beast. While first-class passengers strolled the decks above, completely insulated from the vibration and the noise, these men toiled in obscurity. Their incredible effort was the only reason the ship had lights, heat, and the power to move at all. Theirs is a story of extreme hardship, incredible endurance, and a sacrifice that has been largely overshadowed by the more visible tragedies of that night. To understand the life of a member of the Black Gang, you first have to descend with them. You'd go down narrow, spiraling staircases, far from the sun and fresh air, deep into the bowels of the ship. Here, spread across 6 massive boiler rooms, was their entire world. This was a cavernous, labyrinthine underworld of steel, a place of overwhelming scale and oppressive heat. Picture yourself standing in Boiler Room 6. It's a canyon of metal. In the center are the boilers themselves, 29 of them in total across the ship. The main ones were colossal cylinders, 15 feet in diameter and 20 feet long. From each end, 3 furnace mouths gaped open like fiery maws, for a grand total of 159 furnaces. The air shimmers with a heat that radiates from every surface. The only light comes from the hellish, pulsing glow of the open furnaces, which cast long dancing shadows across a tangled jungle of pipes and valves overhead. And then there's the sound. It's not just noise, it's a physical force that vibrates through the steel floor and up through the soles of your feet. It's a deafening, unrelenting roar. You have the constant rumble of the fires, which devoured over 600 tons of coal a day. Layered on top of that is the rhythmic clang of steel shovels on the floor plates, the jarring slam of heavy iron furnace doors, and the high-pitched hiss of steam. Shouted orders from supervisors barely cut through the din. This was the sound of power, a constant, head-splitting roar that defined every single moment of a worker's shift. And the heat was a living enemy. Temperatures in the boiler rooms routinely soared past 120 degrees Fahrenheit, or 49 degrees Celsius. This wasn't a hot summer's day. It was a dry, scorching heat that blasted from the furnace mouths, intense enough to blister skin from feet away. The men worked in little more than trousers and thin undershirts, their bodies drenched in sweat that did little to actually cool them down. The air itself was thick with the taste and smell of industry. It was saturated with a fine, abrasive coal dust that clogged your lungs and coated your throat, mixed with sulfurous fumes and the metallic tang of hot steel and oil. This was an environment designed for machines, not men. The massive, watertight steel bulkheads that separated the 6 boiler rooms were a constant reminder of how isolated they were, deep below the waterline. This was their office, their factory, and for many of them, it would become their tomb. For the men of the Black Gang, life wasn't governed by the sun, but by the relentless rhythm of their watches. They worked a grueling schedule, 4 hours on, 8 hours off, around the clock. This meant a man's day could begin at midnight, 4 a.m., or any other time, completely detached from the world above. A shift began in the cramped berthing areas, where dozens of men slept in tiered bunks. They'd rise, maybe grab a quick bite, though most avoided heavy meals, knowing the nausea that came with working in the intense heat. They dressed for battle in sturdy boots, hard-wearing trousers, and a simple undershirt. Many wore a sweat rag around their neck, often holding the moist end in their mouths a trick to stave off the dehydrating urge to drink too much water, which could lead to debilitating cramps. Then came the long tramp down the dedicated spiral staircase, deeper and deeper into the ship's hot, vibrating core. Once in the stokehold, the work was precise and punishing. An electrical device called Kilroy's stoking indicator often dictated the pace, signaling which furnace to tend to and when, ensuring consistent steam pressure. The work of a fireman, or stoker, was a repeating cycle of 3 back-breaking tasks. Typically, each fireman was responsible for 3 furnaces. First, for about 7 minutes came the shoveling. This wasn't just tossing coal in a fire, it was a skill. You had to spread the fuel evenly to maintain the most efficient burn. The shovel itself was a heavy tool, and the demand for coal was relentless. The sheer physical output required was staggering, a constant motion of scooping, lifting, pivoting, and throwing, all while facing that blistering heat. Next, for another 7 minutes came the slice. The fireman would take a massive 10-foot-long iron bar called a slice bar and thrust it deep into the fire to break up clinkers, large, rock-hard masses of fused coal ash that choked the airflow. This was heavy, dangerous work. Wrestling the long bar, the fireman would heave it up and down to shatter the clinkers, all while a blast of superheated air and embers erupted from the open furnace door. Then, for the final 7 minutes, came the raking. The broken clinkers and spent ash had to be pulled from the fire. As soon as they hit the floor plates, they were hosed down, sending up clouds of steam and more dust. This ash was then collected and taken to an ash ejector, which used a powerful jet of water to flush it out the side of the ship. After this grueling cycle, the firemen might get a brief moment of rest before a bell would ring, and the whole process would start all over again. And while the firemen were the frontline soldiers, they were supported by the trimmers. The 73 trimmers on board arguably had the worst job of all. Their work took place in the coal bunker's colossal dark spaces that flanked the boiler rooms. Here, the trimmers' primary job was to move mountains of coal with shovels and wheelbarrows to the chutes that fed down to the stokeholds. The danger of a coal avalanche was very real. They were also responsible for trimming the load to keep the ship balanced, and for watching for spontaneous combustion, a very real danger. In fact, a fire had been discovered in one of the Titanic's bunkers after leaving port, and the men had to fight to extinguish it during the voyage. This whole chaotic orchestra was overseen by the 13 leading firemen. These were experienced men who understood the science of steam. They monitored the pressure gauges and directed the firemen, enforcing a harsh discipline because any lapse in the rhythm could mean a drop in speed, something the White Star Line would not tolerate. For 4 hours, this was their existence. Then, caked in grime and utterly exhausted, they would tramp back up from the depths to collapse into their bunks for 8 short hours of rest. So, who were the men who willingly signed up for this? The Black Gang was mostly made up of working-class men. many from the ship's home port of Southampton. For them, the Titanic wasn't just a marvel of engineering. It was a job, a steady wage that could support a family back home. The pay scale clearly reflected the brutal hierarchy of the work. At the very bottom were the 73 trimmers, who earned about £5 and 10 shillings a month. The 163 firemen earned slightly more, at £6 per month. The 13 leading firemen and 33 greasers, who lubricated the massive engines, were compensated a little better. These men were almost completely invisible to the passengers. Their quarters, mess halls, and washrooms were all segregated, designed to keep the grit of their work far away from the polished world above. They lived in large, Spartan dormitories. One room on F deck housed an entire watch of 54 firemen. Their quarters were filled with two-tiered bunks, with long tables and benches fixed to the floor for meals. There was no privacy, no personal space a world away from the private suites just a few decks above. Their food was just as basic. After a shift, exhausted and depleted, they would eat in their own mess. A common meal was a stew known as oodle, a simple but hearty soup of beef and vegetables left to simmer all day. Their free time was consumed by the basic needs of survival: eating, washing, and sleeping, trying to recover before the next bell called them back to the fire. Despite the brutal conditions, a powerful sense of camaraderie existed among the black gang. They had to rely on each other to survive a shift. They shared water, looked out for one another, and developed the kind of gallows humor that thrives in extreme environments. They were a fraternity forged in fire. While historical records often reduced them to numbers, these were men with lives and families. Men like leading fireman Frederick Barrett, a seasoned mariner who would later provide crucial testimony about the sinking. They were drawn by the promise of the world's grandest ship, little knowing they were signing on for a voyage into history. The tools of the firemen and trimmers aboard the Titanic were not grand or impressive to look at. In truth, they were mostly ordinary things, simple, utilitarian, and worn by years of repetition and strain. There was the long-handled shovel, iron-bladed and smooth from use, passed hand to hand through the chain of men feeding the fires. Its handle, wrapped in the sweat and soot of countless shifts, bore the oil of effort. And there were the wheelbarrows and steel buckets, essential for carrying coal, ash, or water across the constantly shifting terrain of the ship's engine spaces. These buckets clanged and scraped, slid and spilled. They were never quite clean, never dry for long, and always underfoot. On the workers' feet were boots thick, heavy, and often ill-fitted. Made of stiff leather, they were designed more to endure the elements than to support comfort. They shielded against the loose coal underfoot and the scalding ash that spilled from the open furnace doors. Over time, the boots lost their shape and stiffness, softening from the damp, the sweat, and the sheer pressure of thousands of steps across iron grating and soot-covered floors. Inside those boots, the men's socks were rarely dry, soaked not only from sweat, but from the ever-present water that pooled in corners of the stokehold, mixing with ash into a greasy black sludge. Blisters formed and hardened, became calluses, and then broke open again. The workers' hands told their own stories. The gloves they wore, if they wore any, were thin cotton or thick wool, easily burned and hard to replace. Many simply worked barehanded, wrapping cloth around their palms if the heat grew too much. Their fingers were blackened, nails rimmed with soot and grime that couldn't be washed away in the cold basin water of the crew's washing areas. Some had burn marks on the backs of their hands from brushing too close to an open furnace or catching a falling cinder. The coal dust settled into every wrinkle, every crack in their skin, until it seemed they themselves were being slowly turned to coal. Even their clothes, plain and utilitarian, bore the evidence of their trade. Woolen trousers, cotton shirts, and thick vests were standard. The shirts were once white or blue or striped, but by the time they made it into the stokehold, they had turned the universal color of labor a tired gray-black, streaked with sweat and filth. No amount of washing restored their original color. They clung to the body, soaked with sweat from the furnace heat, and the fabric chafed at the neck, the elbows, the inner thighs, wearing thin at the seams. Patches were sewn on in the crew quarters during rare moments of rest, the stitches uneven and hurried, but functional. Some men wore caps low, tight-fitting, to keep sweat from running into their eyes or to stop their hair from catching fire. The air in the stokehold was so hot and so dry that even hair felt brittle by shift's end. A few firemen grew beards, not for fashion but to spare their faces from the rawness of frequent scrubbing. There was no elegance in their appearance, only practicality and endurance. The tools of their trade extended beyond the physical. Their muscles were tools, hardened through endless repetition. Their sense of timing, knowing just when to open the furnace door to toss in coal without letting too much heat escape, was as refined as any craftsman's eye. Their lungs adapted to the thick, dry air. They learned to breathe shallow, to cough softly, to ignore the constant itch at the back of their throats. Their ears grew used to the constant thrum of the engines above and the hiss of steam. They no longer flinched at the clang of a falling shovel or the scream of metal expanding under heat. There was a tool belt of sorts, though not everyone wore one. It might hold a wrench, a rag, a metal rod used for breaking up clumps of coal. Each fireman developed his own set of preferences, his own rhythm. Some tied a piece of cloth around their neck to wipe away sweat. Others stuffed cotton in their ears to soften the roar of the engines. Many carried nothing at all, preferring the freedom of unencumbered movement in the stifling heat. Even rest became a kind of tool. Between shifts, men learned to sleep in strange positions, half sitting, curled in corners, slumped against bulkheads. Their sleep was shallow, light, and easily broken, but it was better than nothing. The hammocks and bunks in the firemen's quarters were close together, smelling of damp wool, salt, and bodies. A man's own coat or shirt became his pillow. He rose from his bunk already sweating, pulling on his boots without bothering to lace them fully. There was no point. He would only take them off again in a few hours. There were no clocks in the stokehold. Time was measured in tasks, the filling of a furnace, the emptying of an ash can, the rotation of a wheel. The men lived in a rhythm of heat and exhaustion, in the cadence of coal and fire. Their world was bounded by steel and iron, by rules of necessity. And still, amid all this labor, there was pride. Quiet, unspoken, but present. Pride in knowing the ship would not move an inch without them, that the bright chandeliers and orchestras and crisp uniforms above deck depended on their unglamorous, brutal, and exacting work. The tools might not gleam, they might not rest in velvet-lined drawers, but they were the heartbeat of the Titanic. And the men who used them, though rarely seen by the passengers above, left their mark on every inch of that ship, a layer of sweat and coal that powered a floating city across the Atlantic. The air in the Titanic's underbelly was never truly clean. It was a world of suspended dust and invisible weight, a place where each breath carried the memory of coal, fire, sweat, and steel. To be a coal worker was to inhale the ship's labor with every breath. No breeze ever reached the lower decks. No fresh gust of ocean wind ever cut through the sweltering air of the boiler rooms. The lungs of a fireman or trimmer learned quickly that their lot was not air, but ash and steam. Each time a furnace door opened, a wave of heat surged outward, bright orange light spilling over the dark metal walls like molten liquid. The air shimmered. Dust floated visibly through that glow, swirling and dancing, stirred by the motions of men and shovels and the rush of combustion. The temperature near the furnace could climb past 120 degrees Fahrenheit, and that was considered bearable. Sometimes men claimed they could see the coal itself sweating before it caught fire. Even far from the furnaces, the heat lingered. The walls, the floor, the very structure of the room radiated it. The iron catwalks and grates pulsed with warmth that seeped through boot soles and climbed the bones of the leg. In some corners of the stokehold, the humidity was so thick it hung in droplets from the ceiling and collected on the brows and backs of the men who passed underneath. But it was the ash that truly marked their breathing. Fine, gray-black dust clung to everything. It settled on shovels, coated the floor in a gritty layer, drifted into the cuffs and collars of their clothing. It hovered in the air, disturbed only by the swing of a shovel or the opening of a furnace. Some firemen tried to tie handkerchiefs or rags across their faces, but these offered little protection. The cloth quickly grew damp with sweat, then clogged with soot. Most gave up the effort. It was better to breathe easily and cough often than to choke behind a stifling rag. The cough was constant, not sharp or sudden, but deep and low, an ever-present rattle in the chest. New men came into the job and coughed incessantly for their first week. They choked and gasped and spat into corners, and the veterans would nod knowingly. Their own coughs had never left. Some said it got better over time, that your body adjusted. Others said it just meant the lungs gave up fighting. No one knew which was true. When the boilers let off steam, the sound was a deafening, shrieking roar. It rose above the clang of shovels and the rattle of coal buckets, and pressed in on the ears with a pressure like altitude. The release valves hissed and spat, sending out bursts of wet, hot mist that stung bare skin. The men knew where to stand, how to avoid the worst of it, but even the cautious sometimes misjudged. A blast of steam on the neck or wrist could raise a blister in seconds. The machinery itself breathed too. The engines thudded overhead, not rhythmically, but in a kind of churning pulse. Pipes knocked, valves chattered. Somewhere beyond the boiler room bulkheads, the Titanic's enormous reciprocating engines pounded out their drive. It was a sound you felt more than heard, a tremor in the soles of the feet and in the ribs. Even during the quietest moments, when the firemen rested between shifts or leaned against the wall to catch their breath, the heartbeat of the ship was there, thrumming through steel and stone. Water was a problem of its own. Despite the heat, water pooled in corners, leaked from pipes, dripped from the ceiling, or was tracked in by boots and buckets. It mixed with ash into a slippery, treacherous paste that made every step a hazard. Men slipped and fell often. A twisted ankle could mean the end of a shift. A broken bone might mean losing your place entirely. The foreman expected movement, not excuses. Those who could not keep pace were quickly replaced. The air grew worse in the deeper holds. Ventilation shafts worked constantly, pulling in air from above and drawing out the worst of the smoke, but they were never enough. Men rotated through the worst positions and shifts, taking turns at the furnaces that belched the most heat or the coal bunkers where the dust was thickest. Each man had his own rhythm. Some hummed to themselves while they worked. Others kept time by counting shovels. 10 to this furnace, 10 to the next. It was easier than measuring time by minutes. Rest, when it came, offered no true relief. Even in the crew quarters, far from the engines, the lungs still labored. The men coughed themselves to sleep. Their sheets bore black stains from coal dust clinging to skin. Washing was crude. A splash of cold water from a basin or a quick rub with a damp cloth. The grime never fully left. It settled into the lines of the face, darkened the nails, colored the sweat. Yet, they adapted. It was perhaps the most remarkable thing. Over time, the body learned to endure. The lungs learned to work in half-breaths. The skin toughened. The eyes narrowed in the glare, and the mind grew quiet, not numb, but practiced. The workers did not marvel at the fire or flinch at the smoke. They walked into it as one would walk through morning fog. They knew where to step, how to bend, when to pause. Some firemen swore they could tell the type of coal by the scent in the air. Others said they could tell if a furnace was running hot just by how the smoke curled at the top of the door. Whether these were true or just stories told to pass the long hours hardly mattered. In a place where breath itself came at a cost, where each inhalation carried the memory of labor, those stories gave form to the formless. They gave meaning to the haze. Above them, the passengers breathed fresh, salted air from the North Atlantic. They dined on fine roasts and wines, walked the decks beneath electric lights and moonlight. Below, in the bowels of the ship, men labored in an atmosphere that seemed to belong to another world entirely, a world lit by fire and filled with smoke, a world that steamed and sweated and coughed. And yet the Titanic moved. She surged across the ocean, elegant and unstoppable. Her lights burned. Her decks thrived with life and laughter, all because the men below kept breathing, kept feeding her with their shovels and their lungs. They breathed for her, and in doing so, they disappeared into the air she exhaled. The days aboard the Titanic did not unfold in the same way they did on land. There were no sunrises through kitchen windows, no birdsong to greet the morning. Deep in the ship's heart, the firemen and trimmers lived by a different rhythm altogether, one not marked by natural light or seasons, but by the relentless schedule of shifts known simply as the watch. Each fireman and trimmer belonged to a watch, a team of men assigned to specific hours to keep the furnaces alive. On the Titanic, the standard watch schedule rotated in 4-hour intervals. 4 on, 4 off, 4 on again. It was a cycle that blurred the lines between day and night. Some men began their shifts at midnight, others at noon. But in the depths of the ship, it hardly mattered. Down there, time moved in the throb of engines, the clang of coal, and the bell that signaled a change. The watch bell rang not with music but with authority. A single, heavy clang would echo through the quarters, calling men to rise from their hammocks or hard bunks and ready themselves. It was not a sound that could be ignored. Even in sleep, their bodies seemed to sense it approaching. There were no snooze buttons, no leniencies. A man who missed his watch didn't miss work, he missed his job. Waking meant shaking off the fatigue that never quite left. Even in their off hours, the men did not truly rest. Their bodies cooled only slightly. Their clothes, stiff with sweat and ash, rarely dried completely. Boots, often kept near the bunks, carried the scent to furnace floors, and when laced up again, they slid over tired feet like old weights returning to their place. The walk to the stokehold was always the same. Corridors dimly lit, bulkheads sweating with condensation, the echo of boots on metal, always in pairs or threes, heads low, shoulders hunched. There was no conversation during this march. It was not a ritual that required speech. The air was already changing as they descended, growing warmer, heavier, more alive. A few nodded to the off-going watch, exchanging brief eye contact, shared fatigue, and mutual respect. Nothing more. Inside the stokehold, the furnaces greeted them not as machines, but as demanding companions. The great, gaping doors lined the wall, each marked by number, each alive with red-orange light. The outgoing crew handed over their shovels, sometimes with a tired word of warning, sometimes with silence. The heat was immediate, like stepping into a world built of breath and fire. The men worked without clocks. Time was measured in piles of coal, in the rate of burn. and the feeling of one's own fatigue climbing steadily from ankles to chest. A man might work 3 furnaces during a shift, or 2 if they were running hot. It was not a race, but a relentless demand. The ship required steam, and the boilers were insatiable. In between shoveling, trimmers kept the coal flowing. Their work was often less visible, but no less brutal. They lived in the bunkers, narrow spaces filled to the ceiling with coal, digging it out with shovels and wheelbarrows, breaking it loose when it jammed, passing it down the line. The dust was thick in those chambers, thicker even than in the boiler rooms. Their job was part miner, part mule, and like mules, they worked with their heads down and eyes half lidded from the sting of ash. Occasionally, a shift would go wrong. A furnace might draw poorly, creating a buildup of smoke and gas that stung the lungs and burned the eyes. A coal chute might jam, forcing men to climb into it to dislodge the blockage with sledgehammers and bare hands. In the worst cases, a fire might break out inside the bunker itself, where pressure and heat had ignited pockets of coal. These fires weren't uncommon. The Titanic had already been dealing with 1 bunker fire since she left port. It was considered manageable, as such fires often were, but they required constant watchfulness and water, and men who knew when to act quickly and when to say nothing at all. Meals, such as they were, came during brief respites. Bread thick with crust, hard cheese, strong tea, sometimes a tin of meat or a boiled potato. It was food meant to fill the stomach, not delight the tongue. The men sat on crates or against warm bulkheads, wolfing down bites in the little time they had between shifts or during moments when the fire's appetite was momentarily satisfied. There was camaraderie, of course, not the loud, backslapping kind, but something quieter. A shared glance across the furnace, a hand offered after a slip, a shoulder bumped in passing that said, "I know." Jokes, when they came, were dry and brief. A muttered observation about the coal being Scottish again. A story retold from a previous ship. A curse disguised as a compliment. In this world of shovels and soot, humor was a flare against the dark, small but bright. Relief came only when the next watch arrived. Again, the sound of boots on steel, the shifting of shoulders, the silent trade of places. And then, the return journey. Up, always up, through corridors that seemed cooler now, though only slightly. Clothes clung to skin, eyes blinked against the change in light. Beds, if they could be called that, were waiting. Sleep, in the few hours afforded, came not in soft waves but like a hammerfall. Bodies dropped onto bunks, arms draped across faces, boots still laced, mouths open, breath shallow. Dreams were rare and often unwelcome. In the silence of the crew quarters, the only sounds were the occasional cough, the shift of blankets, and the distant, ever-present heartbeat of the ship's engines continuing above and around them. The cycle would begin again, always again. The watch bell never waited long. For the firemen of the Titanic, time was not measured in hours, but in coals burned, blisters earned, and breaths taken in a world lit only by fire. Below the glittering decks of Titanic's first-class promenades, beneath the fine linens and orchestras, beneath even the modest comforts of third class, there existed another world. Not just of labor and fire and soot, but of rank routine and a rigid hierarchy as firmly constructed as the ship's steel hull. It was a world defined by oil-streaked sleeves, calloused hands, and silent understandings. And within that world, every man knew exactly who he was and who he was not. The engine crew was not a single unit, but a chain linked and stretched across the stokeholds, engine rooms, bunkers, and passageways. At its head were the engineers, officers not in gold braid like the ship's deck crew, but in starched white shirts and black neckties. Their uniforms pressed, but always faintly smudged with the imprint of machinery. These men had training. Many had studied at technical colleges, learned steam theory and pressure tolerances, could draw the inner workings of a triple expansion engine from memory. Their hands were cleaner, but they bore the weight of responsibility heavier than steel. The chief engineer was the highest authority below deck, answering only to the captain. He was rarely seen by most firemen, a distant figure who moved in officer-only quarters. His word transmitted down the ranks like a ripple through iron. Below him, the senior engineers ran each engine room like a fortress, watching gauges, dictating valve movements, recording revolutions in neat copperplate handwriting. Their world was hot and loud but orderly, governed by precision and technical skill. Below the engineers were the leading firemen and the firemen themselves. The leading fireman, often called a petty officer, was the watch boss, oversaw the men at the furnaces, directed their shifts, and carried out orders from above. He had once been a shoveler himself, and still was if needed, but now he carried a whistle on a chain and a heavy notebook, keeping tally of coal consumed, furnaces tended, fires burning too hot or too low. He was the bridge between muscle and management. Firemen were the backbone of the department. Their ranks included veterans of dozens of ships and first-timers hired days before sailing. Age did not matter as much as rhythm, strength, and reliability. They knew the sound of a well-fed furnace and could judge coal quality by sight alone. They did not complain. They worked. And when they collapsed onto their hammocks, they did so without a word. Firemen, like soldiers, trusted each other more than they trusted the engineers. One wrong move by a man on the shovel line, and the whole watch suffered. Even lower in the hierarchy were the trimmers, smaller in number but critical. Trimmers were often young, sometimes teenagers. The job was considered an entry point into the fireman's world. If a man survived a few voyages trimming, he might earn the right to shovel. But trimming was no easy start. It was hot, dark, and claustrophobic. The bunkers were narrow, and coal could shift with a crushing force. The dust was worse there, fine as fog and soaked quickly into the lungs. Trimmers didn't just move coal, they fed the ship's hunger from its hidden stores. Without them, the shovels would fall silent. Among the youngest workers were the messmen, tasked with cleaning the crew's quarters, distributing meals, and delivering tea in chipped mugs to men who barely looked up to accept it. They were not part of the engine crew proper, but existed within the machinery of ship life. Messmen were often overlooked, but their routines kept morale afloat. Then there were the greasers and oilers. Their world was the engine room itself, a cathedral of pistons, shafts, crankwheels, and valves. These men were responsible for keeping the great triple expansion engines running smoothly, applying oil, checking pressure gauges, ensuring that friction did not seize the ship's steel heart. They were meticulous, moving among gears the size of wagons, their shirts always streaked with dark lubricant. Greasers and oilers didn't shovel coal, but without them, the firemen's work would be meaningless. They were machinists in all but name, and their work required focus and trust in both man and mechanism. Despite the brutal conditions, there was an odd sense of pride within this hierarchy. Each man knew his place, and most aspired to rise perhaps not to the level of the engineers, but to earn the respect of their peers. A fireman who could shovel faster than most without complaint might one day be chosen as a lead. A trimmer who showed courage in a collapsed bunker might be offered a place at the furnace. Promotions were rare, but reputation was everything. Reputation bought you a better bunk, a seat closer to the fire during meal breaks, or the benefit of doubt when things went wrong. Discipline was both formal and informal. Engineers kept logs and could recommend punishment or dismissal. But down in the crew quarters, discipline was just as often administered through words or silence. A man who shirked work might find himself without help the next shift. One who grumbled too often might be mocked with dry humor or cold shoulders. The worst punishment wasn't a docking of pay, it was to be distrusted. In the closed, hot world below decks, trust was the air you breathed. Despite this rigid structure, camaraderie ran deep. There was no room for pretense or show. Men stripped to undershirts, soaked in sweat, spoke in rough dialects, and used their hands more than words. When a man was ill, others covered his shift. When coal was low in one bunker, the trimmers doubled up without complaint. When a man fell behind, someone stepped up behind him. It was unsaid, but sacred. In the face of the ship's demands, they stood together. The class system aboard Titanic so stark above decachode even here, in a rougher form. Firemen would never dine in the same quarters as engineers. The deck crew saw them as a separate breed. Officers rarely ventured into the boiler rooms, but among the engine crew the division wasn't about birth or wealth, it was about competence. You were respected if you worked. If you didn't, no lineage or education could save you. The ship's hierarchy shaped everything: where you slept, what you ate, what shifts you drew, how often you saw fresh air. But within that rigid framework, men forged bonds as strong as rivets. They joked in the face of smoke, handed off shovels without complaint, and passed 10 mugs of tea with hands trembling from fatigue. And when disaster finally came to Titanic, this hierarchy would show its truest form. Men stayed at their posts, greasers kept oiling, firemen kept feeding the boilers, not out of fear of punishment, but out of a sense of duty to the men beside them. In the final hours, the engine crew was among the last to leave their stations, and many never left them at all. But for now, in the hum of regularity, they worked. They ate in silence. They rested when they could. They existed beneath the decks, beneath the gaze of passengers, beneath the weight of the Atlantic itself. They kept the heartbeat of Titanic steady and strong, not with ceremony, but with soot, sweat, and silent discipline. The shift would end the way it began, not with a bell or a blast, but with a slow winding down. The rhythms of labor softened, yet never quite ceased. The firemen began to step back from the furnace mouths, their last shovelfuls of coal placed carefully, not rushed. The flames still burned bright, but there was a sense of exhale, of one engine cycle closing before the next began. Men moved slower, not from laziness, but from the accumulated weight of exertion that tugged at their limbs like ballast. A watch lasted 4 hours, but time felt fluid below deck. There were no windows, no sunlight, only the passage of routine and the deep internal clock honed by repetition. One could tell the end of a shift not by any external cue, but by the soft murmur of relieved conversation, the cleaning of tools, the small rituals of transition. A fresh crew would already be arriving, wiping coal dust from their faces as they passed those on their way out. It was a quiet exchange. There was no ceremony, no salute, just a nod, a muttered greeting, an understanding that the cycle must continue. Off-shift firemen and trimmers did not vanish into idleness. They did not retire to comfort or leisure. They made their way to the washroom's modest narrow spaces with rows of basins, all fed by seawater. The water was cold, the soap harsh, and the towels perpetually damp. Coal dust was stubborn. No matter how vigorously they scrubbed, it clung to skin and hair, to fingernails and the folds of their necks. It left behind a shadow, a smudge that became as much a part of their identity as the oil-stained undershirts they wore. They washed not to become clean, but to become clean enough. After washing, many would head to the crew mess room, a low-ceilinged space with long wooden tables and benches bolted to the floor. Meals were not luxurious, but they were filling. Stew, bread, and boiled potatoes were the staples. Sometimes there was salted meat, occasionally a pudding. The portions were calculated to sustain, not satisfy. Tea was constant, strong, and hot, and poured into battered tin mugs that had passed through many hands before. Some men drank slowly, savoring the warmth. Others gulped it down in silence. The food was a small reprieve, a moment of stillness. Conversation during meals was often sparse. Men were tired. They had spent hours yelling over the roar of the furnaces, their voices already hoarse from coal dust. When they did speak, it was with dry humor, with familiarity that came from shared exhaustion. Jokes were muttered. Memories of shore leaves shared in fragments. A comment about the heat, the shift, a rumor overheard from above deck, but mostly there was eating, drinking, and the occasional clatter of cutlery against tin. After meals came rest, or the closest thing to it. Sleeping quarters for the engine crew were below deck, deep in the ship's hull. The rooms were narrow, lined with bunks stacked 2 or 3 high, separated by thin partitions. There was little privacy. Each man had a locker, a small space to store what few belongings he owned. The air was close and smelled of sweat, iron, and old clothes. The heat from the engine rooms radiated even here, and the air rarely felt fresh. Sleep came quickly for most. The physical labor of the job demanded it. Men fell onto their bunks and were asleep in minutes. Boots kicked off, but clothing often left on. The rocking of the ship became a lullaby, the distant hum of engines a constant presence that lulled the senses. Some snored, some muttered in their sleep. Others lay still, barely stirring until the next shift's whistle. There were no soft mattresses or clean sheets. Bunks were hard, blankets scratchy, pillows flat. But to a fireman or trimmer, they were enough. Sleep was not a luxury, it was a necessity. It was the only true escape from the weight of the day. There were dreams, though most never remembered them. The dreams were short, and the rest lighter than it seemed. A door would creak, a man would stir, and the spell would break. Personal possessions were few. A photograph tucked into a locker door, a letter from home folded carefully into a shirt pocket, a small tin of tobacco, a pipe, a prayer card. These items were tokens of another life, reminders of family, of a home far away. Some men carried these things with them always, small talismans of identity. Others kept them hidden, private, tucked away like secrets. Time off shift also brought moments of maintenance. Clothes had to be cleaned, often by hand, scrubbed against a washboard, and hung to dry in the humid air. Boots had to be repaired, laces knotted and re-knotted. Tools were sharpened, inspected, laid out for the next shift. There was little downtime that didn't eventually circle back to preparation. Rest, eat, wash, fix, repeat. The rhythm of life on the Titanic's lower decks was a wheel, constantly turning. Some men wrote letters. There was a post box for crew, and letters would be collected when the ship docked. These letters were brief, often scrawled in pencil, the handwriting rough but sincere. Messages to wives, to mothers, to children. I'm well. The work is hard. The ship is grand. Tell little Mary I'll bring her something from America. These notes were bridges across the ocean, lifelines to the world above and beyond. On rare occasions, a man might venture topside. This was not common, but permitted during free hours. Up there, the world was different. The air was crisp, the wind salty and cool. The stars stretched overhead like diamonds scattered across velvet. Firemen and trimmers walked quietly, aware that they did not belong among the promenading passengers. They stuck to the edges, to the areas designated for crew. Still, it was a breath of something clean, a reminder that the world was wide. But most stayed below, not out of fear, but out of habit. The boiler rooms and bunk spaces had become their domain. They understood the noise, the heat, the iron. It was ugly and hard, but it was theirs. Up above, everything was polished and distant. Below, things were rough and real. The hours between shifts passed quickly. Soon a bell would sound or a knock on the door would come. Time to go again. Time to return to the shovel, the furnace, the endless rhythm. And they would go without complaint. Boots laced, hats pulled low, sleeves rolled. Back into the fire. There was comfort in routine. Even as their muscles ached and the soot clung to their skin, there was a strange peace in knowing what came next. There were no surprises. Just the fire, the coal, the ship, and the sea. And so, they slept, they dreamed, they woke, and the cycle continued. There were stories that traveled down the ladders and through the bulkheads, slipping through the coal dust and the heat to nestle themselves in the minds of the men below deck. Tales passed from man to man, shift to shift, growing in quiet corners between one shovelful and the next. Some of these stories were rooted in memory, others in rumor, some in fear. All of them served the same purpose: to make the endless dark seem a little less endless, the repetition a little less hollow. One of the most common stories told among firemen was not about the Titanic itself, but about the sea. The ocean, in all its vast indifference, was the one constant in every man's life aboard the ship. It could be smooth and silent, or it could howl like a living thing, slamming against the steel hull with a voice that echoed through the bolts and rivets and walls. There were men who claimed to understand it, to predict its moods, its storms, its stillness. Others feared it deeply, speaking of old superstitions, of sea curses and omens and ships that vanished without a trace. During the quiet moments between shifts, when the furnace doors were closed and the bunk rooms hummed with the sounds of sleeping men, those who were still awake sometimes spoke softly of ships that had met strange ends, of cargo ships found drifting, empty, with meals still warm on the table, of ghost lights on the horizon that never approached, never receded, of sounds beneath the waves that no man could explain. The stories were not shared to frighten. They were told almost with reverence, a way to give the sea its due, a way to say, "We know you are greater than us." But not all stories came from the sea. Some were older, passed down from father to son, or from veteran firemen to the young lads just starting out. Stories of the early days of steamships, when the technology was new and everything felt like magic. Of ships caught in winter storms, where the men had to keep feeding the furnaces even as ice formed on their beards and frost climbed the walls. Of ships where the coal ran low, and they had to burn furniture, lifeboats, anything that would catch, just to keep the boilers alive. Some spoke of heroics, of engine room crews who stayed at their posts while the rest of the ship fled, keeping power going long enough for passengers to escape. Names were spoken with respect, though no one was sure if they were real. It didn't matter. The point was not the facts, but the feeling. The sense that below deck, in the heat and dark, there had always been men who kept the heart of the ship alive, even when everything else was falling apart. There were lighter tales too. Stories of clever firemen who tricked the cooks into giving them extra portions, of men who smuggled a bottle of whiskey aboard and shared it one precious sip at a time, of bunkroom pranks, of ghost stories told just before lights out that left even the toughest among them staring into the corners for a bit too long. These were the stories that brought laughter, quiet and hoarse, but real. Some men were natural storytellers. They had a rhythm to their words, a patience in their pacing. They could turn a simple tale of getting lost in a shipyard into a grand epic, or make the tale of a runaway coal cart into something thrilling. These men were valued, not just for their strength or skill, but for their ability to carry others away, even for a few minutes, from the weight of the work. Others were listeners. They nodded, murmured agreement, asked questions, laughed at the right moments. Every crew needed both, the talkers and the listeners, the stories and the silence. Occasionally, a man might share something softer, something personal, a memory of a child back home learning to walk, a letter from a sister filled with neighborhood gossip and notes about the changing seasons, a memory of a wife's hands, always busy, always warm. These moments were rare, and they were never mocked. They reminded the others of the lives waiting beyond the ship, beyond the ocean, of the reason they worked, why they endured the heat and the dark and the bone-deep tiredness. The Titanic was a new ship, still fresh and unfamiliar in many ways, but already stories were forming. Men spoke of the grand staircase, though most had never seen it. They joked about the passengers in their furs and gloves, drinking tea under chandeliers while the firemen sweated and coughed far below. There was a kind of pride in that contrast, not bitterness. A sense of purpose. Let them have their elegance. It was the firemen who kept the whole thing moving. And so, the stories wove through the days and nights, through the shoveling and sleeping, through the meals and the murmurs. They formed a kind of invisible thread that linked each man to the next, back to those who had worked on ships long before, and forward to those who would follow. They gave shape to the hours. They filled the silences. They were as much a part of the engine room as the coal and the flame. Sometimes a story would circle back, told again, slightly different, slightly embellished. The listeners would nod knowingly, remembering the last version, but never interrupting. That was part of the ritual. Let the teller tell, let the heat be forgotten for a while. Let the dark feel just a bit less empty. Even the noise seemed to pause during these times. The hiss of steam, the clank of tools, the groan of steel, all softened. The ship continued its course, slicing through the Atlantic night, but down in the deep belly of the vessel, men told stories. And in that telling, they found something that coal and heat alone could never provide. They found meaning. On the night of the 14th of April, 1912, at 11:40 p.m., the relentless rhythm of the boiler rooms was shattered forever. Leading fireman Frederick Barrett was on duty in Boiler Room 6. His watch was almost over. Suddenly, the engine room telegraph flashed a red light. Stop! Barrett immediately shouted to his men to shut the dampers, cutting the air supply to the furnaces. Before they could, the crash came. It wasn't a huge explosion, but a deep, jarring, grinding shudder that ran down the starboard side. Then, the truly terrifying part. Freezing black water burst through the ship's side. In Boiler Room 6, it poured in, swirling around the boilers and quickly rising 2 feet high. The hellish heat was instantly met with the icy shock of the North Atlantic. In the chaos, a trimmer named George Cavell was buried by an avalanche of coal as the impact tore a bunker open. As the great watertight door between Boiler Room 6 and 5 began to automatically descend, Barrett and the other men scrambled through the narrow escape hatch, sealing the breached compartment behind them. But they found that the damage extended into Boiler Room 5 as well. Water was pouring in. This was the moment the men of the Black Gang faced a choice. The order came down from the engineers. Stay at your posts. This wasn't an act of cruelty. It was a desperate necessity. The ship was dying, but the steam they produced was its last flicker of life. Chief Engineer Joseph Bell and his team of 25 engineers knew what they had to do. They, along with the remaining firemen and trimmers, became the ship's final, heroic line of defense. Their work in those final 2 hours was instrumental in saving the 705 lives that were saved. The steam they kept generating powered the ship's electrical generators. Because these men stayed at their post, the lights on the Titanic remained on until moments before the final plunge. This one fact was incredibly important. The lights prevented mass panic on the decks and allowed for a more orderly evacuation. The electricity also powered the Marconi wireless set, which broadcast the distress signals that summoned the rescue ship Carpathia. Without the Black Gang, there would have been no call for help. It's widely speculated that their actions delayed the ship's sinking by at least an hour, a critical hour for launching the lifeboats. Imagine the scene. The floor plates were now tilting at an ever-increasing angle. The roar of the furnaces was joined by the groan of twisting steel. Yet, the men worked on. Their task now shifted to drawing the fires, venting the massive steam pressure to prevent the boilers from exploding when the cold seawater hit them. Such an explosion would have torn the ship apart. Every single one of the 25 engineers was lost. The toll on the rest of the Black Gang was devastating. Of the 163 firemen, only about 45 survived. Of the 73 trimmers, only an estimated 20 survived. These men, accustomed to working in the shadows, performed their final, most vital duties in the encroaching darkness, and their sacrifice ensured that hundreds of others would see the dawn. In the final accounting of the Titanic, the numbers from the engine department tell a story of immense loss. Of the men who formed the core of the Black Gang, the vast majority perished. They died at their posts, in the dark, far from the lifeboats. In a final, cruel twist of maritime law, their pay was stopped at precisely 2:20 a.m. on the 15th of April, the exact moment the ship officially went under. But the legacy of these men is one of profound, unsung heroism. They weren't millionaires or celebrities. They were laborers. But in the ship's darkest hour, their sense of duty shone brightest. Their final act of keeping the lights on was a direct lifeline to the 705 people who survived. Every distress call sent and every lifeboat launched was owed in large part to their fortitude. They were the beating heart of the great ship, and they kept beating until the very end. Today, memorials in Southampton and Liverpool stand as quiet tributes to the 244 engineers, firemen, trimmers, and greasers who were lost. But their true memorial is written in the stories of the survivors. They are a powerful reminder that history isn't just shaped by captains and kings, but by the forgotten armies who toil in the heat and the dark. The story of the Titanic is incomplete without the story of its firemen and trimmers, the men who, covered in sweat and coal dust, embodied the truest meaning of courage. If you found this look into one of history's forgotten stories compelling, make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell for more weird history. And let us know in the comments what other hidden stories you'd like to see us explore. Thanks for watching.